Is Berserk sexist? This question, I'll admit, is a little disingenuous. For my money, it's very difficult to call any piece of media on its own any one thing, especially a work as expansive and varied as Berserk. A better question might be, does Berserk have sexist moments? Or maybe even, does Berserk attempt to advance sexism as a movement? Even these questions are a little ridiculous and inherently inflammatory, however. The more accurate and less silly question I want to ask today is, what does Berserk have to say about gender and sex? I don't really give a shit about how woke it is or how it adheres to any social movement, because such questions are, as we all know, gay as hell. Before we start though, this video contains graphic depictions of sex-related violence, so if you're sensitive to these kind of things, please feel free to sit this one out. Also, this might be heavily censored for YouTube, so please enjoy the full uncensored version on Patreon. Link is in the description. Part 1. Sexism. I want to say, to begin with, that this discussion will not include whatever nonsense went on with Twitter a while back. I only got into Berserk recently, and I don't look at anything but fan art on Twitter, so I'm not going to address any specific critiques here. This is just sort of an explanation on my own merits. The specific question I'm going to ask for Part 1 in this video is, however, does Berserk depict women negatively in any way? For the sake of clarity and to cut down on the sort of clickbait, I'll say it up front that the short answer is no, and the long answer is sort of. Many pieces of media that are of a grim and or dark persuasion tend to use sexual violence against women as shorthand for evil, Berserk included. Game of Thrones is the classic example of this that's closest to Berserk that I can think of. Game of Thrones has had a lot of critics that cite the excessive use of sexual violence as a turnoff for them, which I think is an accusation that's worth examining. What does it say about your female characters that they constantly fear sexual abuse? And certainly, a theme of sexual violence would make specific people not desire to engage in a work, especially victims of sexual violence. I even added a content warning at the beginning of this video. But this, of course, is different than critique. The statement, "this has something I don't like in it, therefore I won't watch it," is very different than "this thing is bad." Game of Thrones and Berserk are very different, however, in one specific sense. Other than one's an anime and one's a live-action TV show. Game of Thrones' sexual violence is uniformly against women, but Berserk actually features men being sexually abused as well. The main character, Guts, in particular, was sold off by his adoptive father to another man for sex, an event which led Guts to have intense PTSD related to sex. Griffith, too, the main antagonist, is preyed upon as a young man by a much older man. And in the instances of women's sexual abuse, namely with Casca, the subject is not treated as shorthand either. In Casca's case, surmounting her own sexual abuse at the hand of a nobleman she was given is the reason that she is such a powerful warrior. Later, when she is raped by Griffith, her trauma is so intense that she regresses into a childlike state for most of the rest of the comic. Even when she's cured of this, she is racked with unstable flashbacks due to this event. These are charitable interpretations, one that inspire a deep degree of hope into people. In fact, the culmination of Guts' own struggle with rape is growing close enough to Casca to have sex with her, even though his PTSD triggers a response such that he strangles Casca, believing himself to be acting in self-defense. Through Casca's understanding and shared pain, Guts is able to overcome his trauma outright. Though perhaps not realistic, this inspires hope and a healthy way to portray such things. Casca, too, who is so often the prey to unwanted advances by enemy fighters and even some allies, hell, even Guts after the eclipse, is treated as a peer by her male allies. There's only one time when Guts chastises her for her gender, and this is only to try to misguidedly convince her to give up on mercenary life to be safe. Casca's incessant, unrelenting victimization reads to the reader as exhausting. The reader is put in Casca's shoes, given a glimpse into what it must be like for a woman in this universe. A piece of prey. Casca is forced to push down her menstruation cramps in the midst of battle. She has to risk much more than her male peers. It's not played for a laugh, and it's not played for misery porn. It's played so that we, the audience, can sympathize. This is all admirable, but at the same time, Berserk does portray some unsavory moments of sexual abuse. The story regresses somewhat, in fact, in later arcs. There are two separate plot points that hinge around women forcibly being by demons, once with trolls and once with Emperor Ganishka's Daka soldiers. This falls back into the Game of Thrones issue, but at the same time, these instances are treated as genuinely horrific. Need I bring up the infamous horse? What is Berserk trying to say about sexual abuse, then? What is the reader's impression of sexual assault that comes through in these depictions? Berserk essentially says, sexual abuse is deeply traumatic, but it is surmountable by anyone willing to come to terms with it. Anyone who performs sexual violence is deeply evil. You'd have to try quite hard to twist Berserk into a story where sexual abuse is somehow glorified, and calling it sexist would be bad faith, to say the least. There is a potential issue with people who enjoy the moments of sexual violence as depicted in some gratifying way, but the idea of blaming Berserk for this is laughable. You can't blame a piece of media for every uncharitable reading that is made of it. There's nothing wrong with depicting sexual violence within the pages of a piece of media that everyone is on board with the contents of. Sure, sexual violence is a barrier to entry for some people, and that's a shame, because Berserk is a beautiful work of fiction, but that's up to their own autonomy. In fact, in some ways, Berserk is laudable for including such a frankly daring depiction of one of the darkest, most disquieting parts of humanity. Berserk has always excelled at pulling comfort out of the most staggering, bleak circumstances, and its depiction of sexual violence is no different. It takes an author writing with a vast amount of care to thoughtfully pull off depicting these things, especially in such a stark, unfiltered way that Berserk does. At the end of the day, Berserk is a piece of media that doesn't hide nor discard the people who have been abused, which is so often the case in discussions like this. Miura puts Guts front and center and makes him a survivor. Too often, when people shy away from depicting sexual violence, they shy away from its victims, too. By marginalizing these acts, they marginalize those who have been acted upon. It's a shame, and it's heartening to see Berserk quietly fight against this, even if its depictions aren't always spot on. So, is Berserk sexist? No. It could be better. It could be worse. It was written by a flawed man about flawed people for flawed people to read, who Miura trusted enough to see what he was trying to say. Part 2. Homosexuality. Unfortunately, homosexuality is not given as much careful concern as gender in Berserk. Like I said in the first part, there's a specific question at play that we have to keep in mind. In this case, the question is, what does Berserk have to say about gay people? Most of the discussion of homosexuality in Berserk stems from the earlier portions of the story and around Griffith. Griffith is heavily implied to be bisexual, don't let Reddit fans tell you otherwise, and this framing is very intentional. Griffith's main homosexual run-in is with Genin, who Griffith has sex with to get money to avoid fighting in his many battles when the Hawk was beginning their life as a mercenary band. Other people interpret Griffith's unique affection for Guts as homosexual, which makes sense. Griffith has never connected with anyone else in a way that he did with Guts, and it isn't far-fetched to think this might be romantic. Griffith tends to view most sex as transactional, as with Genin but also with Charlotte. His seduction and courting of Charlotte begins because he very transparently wants to become king. Even his daydream after his year-long torture when he is married to Casca is startlingly domestic, and when he later rapes Casca in the form of Femto, he's only doing so out of explicit spite for Guts. The relationship with sexuality here, of course, is monstrously toxic. Even with Guts, who Griffith can be read to be in love with, is treated like an item. Griffith's fall into grief is only because Guts leaves him. The only other implied gay character, of course, is Guts' which, yeah, not ideal. This all leads to that question, what does Berserk have to say about gay people? The answer being, homosexuality is the cause of sexual abuse. The three implied gay characters in Berserk are, uniformly, rape, particularly if you remove Griffith from that equation. This notion is pervasive and quite poisonous, and it makes me sad to see it in a piece of media that I enjoy quite a bit, but it's worth bringing up. I could see an argument against this to the perspective of, well, sure, gay relationships are depicted as abusive, but there's plenty of heterosexual abuse in the comic as well. And that's true, there are many instances of men preying on women, as discussed, but the critical difference is that there are positive heterosexual relationships too. There's nuance enough not to color heterosexuality at large as bad. For instance, Guts and Casca's love, in fact, is the driving force of arguably most of the comic. Now, this isn't all to say that I think Miura is a bad person or that I think that we should cancel Berserk, of course. No piece of media is free of critique, and I would argue bringing up this point and discussing it shows more love to Berserk as a piece of media than trying to paint Berserk as some kind of paragon of virtue. In other words, I don't think Miura hates gay people. I think Miura has been indoctrinated by the same gay-hating culture that a lot of Japanese manga artists are writing under. Can he be blamed for that? No. But can he be held accountable for it? Sure. Part 3. Gender. Berserk has basically nothing to say about gender. Lol. Part 4. Just kidding. Honestly, I don't have that much to say here about gender. Berserk features, as far as we know, only cisgendered characters, which is fine, actually, given how some Japanese media can be about this topic. Griffith is often said to have the beauty of a woman, which makes him sort of gender non-conforming, which is kind of cool because it's presented as a positive trait, which is nice. Sure, we'll let him have that one. Let's make one other character trans for fun, though. Let's say, Judo. Judo can be trans. Good for her. Part 4. That's it, actually. So, full disclosure, I have a kind of chip on my shoulder about this stuff. I got into Berserk basically on the recommendation of a trans friend and another trans woman's video essay about it, and when I finally finished the manga, I got a really coherent sense of clarity from Berserk about sex that I really never see in manga, that I discussed in part 1, and it felt great. But imagine my shock then when I discovered that most online Berserk fans are essentially weird reactionaries with lolly avatars. Kind of cringe. This video is just my desire to express nuance with this piece of media, since it really does seem like so many people read this weird totalitarian thing into Berserk. I joked in my last video about the Griffith did nothing wrong statement, but I found more than a few pieces about how people actually kind of agreed with this position unironically. It's fucking weird. There's this massive sect of people who, for lack of a better term, read Berserk wrong. They think it's this grimdark dream, like fucking Warhammer 40k, and they don't really like when the manga develops past that. For those of you who've read the manga, I'll put it like this, I guess. If you've read Lost Children and thought that Guts was cool for killing all those fairies like a badass, you're reading Berserk wrong. But anyway, that's me just giving you my bias. But like I said, this video has to be censored for YouTube. I didn't include many graphics for that reason, but I also had to cut sections out of the script for YouTube and censor some things. But if you'd like to hear the full version of this essay, it's up on my Patreon. The link is in the description. So thank you again. Bye.